Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today is a big day. We're gonna start our backend track in our tutorials in YouTube. So we're gonna start with PHP and particularly a micro framework called Slim, which is a very powerful, lightweight framework that you can use to create web applications and APIs. We already had a simple mini tutorial on how to create a backend API using Node.js, and in that we used the Happy framework. So please go ahead and check that out if you're interested in Node. But today we're gonna be using Slim. So nowadays, Laravel, which is another framework in PHP, is potentially the most popular one. Uh, for those of you guys who I asked in the community section what you're using, you basically said Laravel mostly. Bear with me. I have already promised we're going to create a tutorial on how to create sign up and log in using PHP authentication. So this is going to be a starting point. The concepts are pretty much similar between frameworks. It's just the implementation that is a little bit different. So for this matter, let's just dive in and start um, learning how to use a Slim. So if I scroll down in the Slim framework website, you'll see that they recommend to install the framework using Composer Dependency Manager. And what the dependency manager do is basically download and installs the dependencies that you need in your project. And in this case, we need Slim framework as a dependency in our project. And this composer is basically, for those of you who know Node.js and Ruby, it's basically inspired by NPM in Node.js and Bundler in Ruby. So let's get started. I will go into my terminal. I'm going to create a new directory called, let's call it Slim Crash Course, right? Going into that directory, I'm going to create a directory called src, which our source files will reside. And then within the src, going to src, I'm going back here. I'm just going to click on this composer dependency management and goes to the website. In the download section, you can see there's a piece of script over here. I'm copying this piece of code and just pasting it, and you can see that it already starts downloading the composer and how to use it. So now if I do a listing of my directory, you can see that I have the composer.var within the src directory. Next thing we need to do, I'm going to back to the Slim framework website. In the user guides, there is an installation section where basically tells us how to install it. So using the composer, this line basically adds the Slim framework to our project. Going back to src folder, obviously our file is called composer.var. What it does, it starts downloading the Slim framework and adds it as a dependency, right? So if I do a listing of my directory now, we have three new files and directories: composer.json, composer.lock, and the vendor directory, which includes the dependency that we downloaded right away here. Now it's a good time. If you use any version control like Git, you can go ahead and push this code in your repository and make sure you don't push the vendor. So um, what I would do is I'm going to go one level up and open the Visual Studio Code. I'm using Visual Studio Code mainly in my projects. So as you can see in the src, we have our vendor. And if I open the composer.json, you can see it actually has a uh, object require that says our project requires the Slim framework version 3 upwards, right? So now within the src, I'm going to create a new directory called public. This is where I put my public files. Uh, I'm creating a new file called index.php. And if I go back to the Slim website, you can see that it basically says just require the vendor autoload and you're good to go. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So I have the PHP and then require vendor autoload, all good. And just to make sure that we understand here, that code assumes that the vendor directory is at the same level of index, but for us it's one level up. So we need to do dot dot slash so that it points to the right path and the location. So now, in order to create and start developing with Slim, I'm going to create a variable called app. So this is going to be our variable that basically defines our app in Slim, and I will create a new object, a new Slim, and then app class. Now, the next thing I would like to do is just call the run function for that object I created. So now this is pretty much how we bootstrap our application. The next thing we want to do, we need to define some routes, right? So the way to do it, I'm going to do app and then call get method and then define the path that I want, which is slash, which is the root of our application or document root. And then the second parameter is a function that actually accepts a request and response and then arg as parameters. And then what the simplest thing we can do, we just can say a response and then call the write method on it and say welcome to Slim crash course from frontend tips. So now so now we've already created the simplest application that you can imagine using Slim. The way to basically serve it, we can use the PHP development server. Right now we are in the src folder. I'm going to public, and then within the public, what I'm going to do is type php-s and then our localhost, which is our host, and then a port like 8002. So you can see that it says PHP 5 development server started, and it's listening on this port, and the document root is at the public, which is correct. Now, if I go ahead, open a new browser, if I run it, sorry, I have to basically uh, copy this localhost 8000. And now here, if I call it, you'll see that it says welcome to Slim crash course from frontend tips, right? Pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead, and now you can see that this is the simplest case of using the Slim framework to create an API. The next thing I would like to do is, if you remember in our YouTube channel, we created the last tutorial is a full-featured autocomplete suggestion, which is an enhancement to this tutorial over here. If you haven't watched them, please go ahead and do. What I would like to do is that um, if you remember, if you type A, it shows Argentina, Armenia, I, India, and basically this is coming from an array of objects we defined in the front end. What I would like to do is just move the logic of this filtering and selection from the front end to my backend API. So what I need to do, I'm just going to copy this, going back to my editor, going to paste it for a while here. Obviously, this is in JavaScript. But how are we going to do it? I'm going to create a new countries. It's an array. And then within the array, the way we want to have these the same way, I'm going to say array. The key is going to be name and the value is going to be USA. I'm going to copy these 3 times more and copying India, Argentina, and then Armenia, right? And then I'm going to remove this. So now we have an array countries which has these arrays. Now I'm going to just copy this um, route and then say define a new route called countries. And then here instead of write, I would like to write the countries instead, right? So now if I call localhost 8000, what was the port here? 8002. If I call 8002 slash countries, I expect in return to see this in my browsers. Now the important thing is that the write method actually accepts just a string in order to pass the array and ultimately convert it to JSON, which is JavaScript object model that is used in many projects. we're going to use a handy function called with JSON, and then we need to return this function, right? So basically we say return with JSON countries, but the most important thing is that countries over here, if we run it, it says I don't know what country is, because the country over here is a global um, array, or it's a global variable which is an array. In order to tell the tell this method to understand what the country is, we use this use, and then we pass the countries here as a parameter. So now the countries, which is a global variable, is now bound to the scope of this function, right, or method, which is here. Now, if I just run this, if I go to my browser, go to localhost, and then call countries, you can see that I already get the array of objects that I had in my JavaScript, right? So I'm getting pretty much the same thing. So now in this project, what we've done is that whenever we input a value, it basically goes ahead and filter this list and checks for the names that starts with that input. In this case, it's Armenia and Argentina. Now we're gonna move that logic outside of the front end and put it in our backend, right? Going back to the backend, I'm going to create a new route, and here I'm just going to say slash countries, and then slash maybe countries slash search. And so this is going to be our new endpoint where we use to pass that input from here and get the results back from this list. So here I'm just going to say function, a request, and then response and args, and then I'm just going to say use countries because the countries is a global variable. And then within this function or method, what I would like to do is get the term that we enter over here, right? So basically, the, I'm just going to add a comment over here to show you the actual endpoint. What we type in the browser or what we call from the front end is going to be slash countries slash search. And then I pass a query parameters called term equals to the value of the input, let's say A, right? So the way in Slim, the way you use you basically get these term query parameter, I'm going to create a new variable called params, and then I just say request because this is coming by, within our request, and then just say get call get query params, and this method basically gives me an array that includes all the query parameters. In this case, it's going to be an array of only one element, which is term. So I can easily just rename these params to term. I know this is an array, so I'm just going to say give me the term here. So now I can, just to test it, I can say response right, and then say my term is, and then just say term. One important thing is that when you are using a variable within your string over here, you need to use double quotation so that it can interpolate this value. So now if I go ahead here and instead of countries, I just say countries search and then pass the term as query parameter A, you can see that I get a response. My term is A. So now I know that I'm getting the correct value. The next thing I want to do is that I want to filter this array and then create a new array with the new filtered values and then return that, right? So what I would like to do, I'm going to use for each method or function in PHP and say for each of my countries as key and value. Uh, so basically key is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3 in this case, and the value will be would be each of these. So here, the way in JavaScript we did it, I'm going to show you in JavaScript, we basically do a filter. So we go countries filter, and for each of those countries, we just say if the name of this country to lowercase starts with, you know, the input that we put over here also to lowercase, right? Um, so how are we going to do it in PHP? So in PHP, there is no starts with method. I have to actually create a new function, starts with, and then the first parameter will be my actual string, and then the second parameter will be my substring, right? First things first, I'm just creating a variable called len, which holds the length of the substring. So I'm just going to say strlen, which is a method in PHP that gives me the length of my substring. And then I just return a boolean, and that boolean is basically uses the substr method of PHP, passing the first parameter will be my string, which is going to be any of these, for example, in our case. The second will be the first index, and the third will be the len that I get. So this basically gives me the substr, uh, the same substr if it exists. If this is equal to my substring, it means that this substring is actually within the string, and also it starts, and this string starts with that substring, right? So this function I can use here now for each of the countries. I know that the country is the value name, so I basically say if starts with passing the value and then name. This will give me USA, India, Argentina, Armenia. If this, uh, and the second parameter is my term, right? Whatever I input in here. So if this is valid, so if it's true, if it actually starts with that, I will, before the for each, I will create an array called filtered countries, right? I just say it's an empty array. And then if this case applies, I would like to push using the array push method in PHP. I want to push um, this new value inside my filter countries, right? So everything looks all right. The important thing is that since these starts with uppercase, I need to make sure both these and the input that I get through the term are all lowercase. So PHP has str to lower method that I can use. So I'm just going to say str to lower for both of them. And now I can simply just after this, I know that based on this that I type, I just want to make sure that I return a response and then with JSON and then the filtered countries, right? So now if I go back in my browser and then call this function, you can see that my term starts with A and it will return Argentina and Armenia. If I say I, it will return the India, and if I say U, it will return USA. So our API now is ready. Now, how are we going to utilize it here in our code? I'm just going to fork this so that it's a new one. Now, I'm going here in my JavaScript. Instead of using this filter over here, I'm just going to call our endpoint. So I'm going to do this. I will just comment this out, and instead I'm using the fetch API from JavaScript. I know my address is localhost 8002 slash countries and then countries slash search, and then I have my term equals to plus, and this is where my input is search input.value, so I just pass input over here, and this is then I will just then use then. I know that this is the result is JSON, so I'm just going to say response and then convert it to response JSON by calling response JSON. And then here I get the results that I expect in the JSON format. Now you can see that before we had these suggestions, I can use the same name here. So suggestions, And then here inside, I'm just going to copy this code and paste it in this callback of then, right? So I will go and tell you what this exactly do. So we basically use the fetch API calling our endpoint with the input that we want as the term. We convert the response to JSON using this, and then ultimately what we get back is the suggestions that we get. For example, when we press U, we get this, and then it basically builds our input. The more important thing is that, so now if I go to the inspector in Chrome, I'm just going to do this. And then if I go to network tab, if I press A, you can see that it literally calls our endpoint and it returns the correct values, right? But why it's not working? Because now we are using this promise or callback function over here. We need to actually show our suggestions list within this method, right? So now if I press I, let's see what happens. We have suggestions panel, class list.add show, suggestions.for each. So I just want to make sure I'm getting the right value. Yes. And then let's see what happens that it doesn't work. Let's just type A. Oh, we're gonna have some errors here that are bounding. Right. So now you can see that even though I'm calling our backend, I get this error. It says access to fetch blah 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 from origin kothus.com has been blocked by core's policy. It says no access control allow origin. The reason being that my front-end application is running on kothus.com, but my backend application is running on this HTTP localhost 8002, and for security reasons, it will not let me retrieve the results that I want in the JavaScript application. So now the way I'm going to fix it, I'm just going to search for a Slim framework and then course. Let's see what we get back. It says setting up course here. And then what it says is that you can basically use this function with header and says access control allow origin and then pass the site that is supposed to be accepted by our backend, right? So going back to my um, backend, here, instead of uh, uh, we have the with JSON, but also we add the with header. So I'm going to say with header, and instead of using kothus.com, I'm just going to put star, meaning that it will return the result from basically any website that calls this backend, right? Now, if I go back and I refresh, if I type A, you can see that now I not only call the backend in the network tab, you can see that I not only called it, but also I showed the result. And this is called full stack, like a front end application and a backend application, right? So it argues that it doesn't know any suggestions, so I'm just going to remove this. So now if I start typing A, and I can choose this, and if I go back, you can see that it literally works the way I want. So yes, the last thing I want to do, if I empty this up, we're going to have the same issue as we had in the previous tutorial. It's going to show all of this. So if I go to the backend here, and instead, if here I do a check if my term is actually empty, which is in this case, when we, clear this out, the term is going to be empty. I'm just going to return the same thing as I returned here, but instead of the filtered country, I just return an empty array, right? So now if I go ahead and say Armenia, okay, good, and then if I all right, and then if remove, nothing will show up. Great. So today we not only built a backend API using PHP, but also we modified one of our tutorials to actually use our backend API to fetch the results. I no longer, for example, need these countries over here. And you'll see that it starts getting the results from the backend API. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Uh, In the next tutorial, I'm going to talk about how we can actually deploy this API in our server. And also, I'm going to show you how you can move this code from here to our API or website to basically have everything in one place. And from then on, I'm just going to talk about how we can create a login and authentication sort of logic in the backend. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and do. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please like and share it. And of course, if you have any suggestions or any concerns or any comments, go ahead and put this in the comment section. And I wish you a great day and night. See you next time.